Read it out again, Fernacre. I don't believe the back pews heard you. The Duke of Fernacre stood at the chancel step of his own chapel with his brother's letter in his good hand and 140 people behind him and read it out again, because the alternative was to stand there and say nothing while a woman waited at the door in her mother's veil. Corwin. By the time this is put into your hand, I shall be at Boulogne and not alone. I cannot marry Miss Wen. I have never been able to marry Miss Wen. I only lacked the nerve to say so before the license was got. You will manage it. You always do. The settlement is drawn upon Fernacre and not upon me, so it costs you nothing to stand where I was to stand, and it saves the family a great deal of noise. Piers. The noise it saved the family arrived immediately, in the form of 140 people all whispering at once. He might have written to her, somebody said, delighted. He has written to her, said Lady Honoria Vass, from the second pew, loud enough for the rafters. By way of the Duke. It is the most economical jilting I have witnessed in 40 years. 11 months later, the Duke of Fernacre would stand at the back of a church court in Norwich and hear, in his wife's own voice, the single fact that would take apart every judgment he had made of her since that morning, and by then he would have signed away, in his own hand, the right to say one word in answer. He did not know that yet. That morning he knew only that his leg was bad in the cold, that his sword hand had not closed properly since a wet field in Spain 9 years before, and that Miss Tabitha Wen was standing in the west door in a made-over gown with her father's dead white face on her, and no father to walk beside her. She did not weep. He watched for it, expecting it, half wanting it, because a woman weeping could have been sent home in a carriage and the thing would have been over. She simply stood and looked down the aisle at the empty place where his brother should have been, and then at him, and waited to be told. Corwin folded the letter. Miss Wen, Your Grace, there is a license, a settlement, and 140 witnesses. There is also a door behind you and my carriage at it, and no man in this county will say a word against you if you use it. He heard his own voice come out flat and hard and could not make it do otherwise. Or the license can be altered. It wants one word, mine, and Your Grace would do that. Why? Because my name is on the shame of it, he said, and because my brother is a coward and I have spent 9 years cleaning up after him, and I would rather do it standing at an altar than in a magistrate's parlour. Somebody in the third pew laughed. Tabitha Wen heard it. Her chin came up perhaps half an inch, and she walked the whole length of that aisle alone, past every one of them, and stood beside him at the step. Then alter it, she said. The curate altered it. The bishop's license had been made out for Lord Piers Fernacre. A line was drawn and Corwin's name written above it, and the register signed, and the thing was done in 11 minutes. There were no bells. Lady Honoria left before the vestry, which she afterwards described as delicacy. He said the unforgivable thing in the carriage, and he said it deliberately, because he had been taught in the army that a clean-cut heals and a ragged one does not. You will have my name and Fernacre, and 200 a year settled on your mother that Piers would never have paid. You will not have me. He looked out of the window at the wet park. I am not a husband. I am a man with a bad leg and a hand that will not hold a rein, and a brother who sells his family by the letter post. Do not mistake what happened this morning for anything but a debt paid. If you are hoping for more, hope now and be finished with it, and we shall deal very well together. The carriage went 1/4 mile. Your Grace, Tabitha said at last, may I say one thing, and then never say it again? Say it. You have just told a woman who was left at an altar in front of her mother's friends that she must not hope for anything. Her hands were folded and perfectly still in her lap. You have taken the only thing that was still mine to have, which was my own private opinion of what I might one day be given, and you have taken it in a carriage where I cannot get out. That was not kindness. It was neat. They are not the same, and I would be obliged if Your Grace would learn the difference before we reach the house. He had no answer to that. He was 38 years old, and he had commanded men, and he had no answer at all. She did not leave in the week that followed, or the month. He had assumed she would, until his own attorney set him right at the end of November. She cannot go, Your Grace. The 200 is settled upon her mother, not upon her, and it is conditional upon the marriage subsisting. It was drawn that way to bind Lord Piers, who would otherwise have bolted. As if I may say so, he did. The attorney turned the deed round. If her Grace leaves Fernacre within the first 12-month, the annuity fails, the Wen cottage reverts, and her mother, who is 59 and lame, goes to her sister-in-law at Ipswich, who will not have her. Her Grace read this clause on the morning of the wedding in the vestry before she signed. Corwin sat back very slowly. She read it before she signed. She read every line of it, Your Grace, and asked me 2 questions about the second page, and then she went out and married you, knowing exactly what the door behind her was worth. The attorney gathered his papers, which is to say, nothing at all. There is a swelling under the jaw of the bay filly, Your Grace, and I want the whole of the top yard shut by dinner. The Duchess of Fernacre said it in the doorway of the breakfast room at 7:30 in the morning in December. In a stable apron with her sleeves turned back and mud to the knee of her boots, Corwin set down his cup. Sturrock is my head groom. Sturrock sent me. He has been at Fernacre 31 years and has never had strangles in this yard and does not know what he is looking at. I have had it twice. She came in 1 step, no further. My father kept 9 mares at Wen and lost 7 of them in one spring when I was 14, because the man who advised him waited 4 days to be sure. I am not asking Your Grace to believe me. I am asking for the top yard, the far paddock, 2 buckets that go nowhere else, and Sturrock's boy to sleep in the tack room for a fortnight. The Cottesbury sale is in March. 11 yearlings. 11 yearlings are £900 if they are alive in March, and nothing at all if they are not. She waited. Your Grace has until the horses are watered, and then I shall do it anyway and be sorry afterwards, which I would rather not, because I do not like being sorry. Corwin looked at her for a long moment. There was a smear of bran on her cuff, and her hair was coming down at one side, and she was, he thought with something like alarm, entirely at home. Do it, he said. Tell Sturrock I said so that it costs him nothing. Thank you. She was gone before he could answer, which he was beginning to understand was a habit. It took 5 weeks. The bay filly came through it, and so did the roan. A yearling colt did not, and Tabitha sat up in the tack room with him. He died, and came in at 6 grey to the lips and went straight back out to the far paddock, because the ones that were living still wanted feeding. £900 went to Cottesbury in March and came back as 1140, which was more than the Fernacre home farm had cleared in 4 years. He learned other things about her that winter that she never told him. That she had taken the East Wing accounts off a housekeeper who had been robbing him for a decade, and done it so gently the woman was still in the house and grateful. That she never offered him her arm and never looked at the stick, and had once let him take 4 full minutes to cross the long gallery beside her while she talked about drainage, and had never once said, as everyone else in England said, "Are you quite comfortable, Fernacre?" Lady Honoria Vass came to dinner in February and sat on his left. I do think it brave of you, Duchess, to have taken up the horses. It gives you something. A woman in your position must have something. It gives me £1140, ma'am. Yes, you have a great deal of your father in you. He was very fond of a figure, poor man, at the end. Lady Honoria turned her rings. One hears from Bologan, by the by. Lord Piers is much admired there. He always was the handsome one. A small pause, exquisitely placed. Of the 2. There was that sort of silence in which 14 people find things to look at. He is, said Tabitha quite pleasantly, he is much the handsomer. He rides better than his brother now, and dances better, and writes a prettier letter. 140 of us heard the last one. She passed the salt to her left. But when a horse is bought at Cottesbury, ma'am, the man who buys it does not stand at the rail admiring the head. He watches how it goes on the 4th mile. Lady Honoria opened her mouth and did not use it. At the far end of his own table, Corwin sat perfectly still with his damaged hand out of sight below the cloth, and for the first time since a wet field in Spain 9 years before he did not feel entirely like a debt other people had agreed to pay. Afterwards, in the yard in the dark, he found her at the rail of the far paddock in a shawl over her dinner gown, feeding the bay filly a crust. You did not need to answer her. No, Tabitha agreed, but she was not talking about me. The filly took the crust and butted her shoulder, and Tabitha shoved her off with an elbow like a farmer. Your Grace should go in. It is bitter and the yard is uneven, and you will pay for it tomorrow. That is the first time you have mentioned it. It is the first time it has been dark and the ground bad and nobody else about, she said. There is a difference between managing a man and telling him the ground is bad. I have never insulted your Grace, and I do not intend to begin in a stable yard. He walked back to the house behind her, slowly watching the lantern swing. And in the doorway of the gun room, where the light from the hall fell across the flags, he stopped, because a thing had been happening for 11 weeks that he had not once put words to, and it chose that moment to present itself. Every door in Fernacre had been rung, not all at once. One a fortnight, quietly, on the estate carpenter's ordinary time, the gun room, the library, the east stair, the terrace, rehung to open the other way, so that a man crossing them with a stick in his right hand did not have to change hands to work the latch. Nobody had asked him. Nobody had mentioned it. There was no note, no account, no small look across the dinner table waiting to be thanked. Corwin stood with his hand flat on the frame for a long time, entirely unable to say what it was he was feeling, only that it was not gratitude, and that it was going to be a great deal of trouble. There is a strap on the near rein, Corwin said, and I did not order it. No, said Tabitha. The saddler at Beccles made it. It is buckled, not sewn, so it comes off in a minute if it offends you. He stood in the coach house in April looking at a loop of plain harness, leather stitched to the rein of his own phaeton, sized to a hand that would not close. It will look extraordinary. It will look like a strap. She was checking the traces and did not turn round. Your Grace has not driven himself since Michaelmas, because the near rein slips at the 3rd mile and you will not have a groom see it. That is 9 months of not going anywhere, on account of what a man on the Beccles road might think of a piece of leather. I have made no other remark, and I shall make none. He drove himself to Cotsbury and back that week, 11 miles each way, and did not tell her, and found on his return that she had gone to bed and left a note on the hall table that said only, the 3rd mile. Spring came on. He got into the habit of walking out to the top yard after breakfast, because that was where she was, and then of taking his letters out there, and then of not taking anything at all. Spain, she said one morning out of nothing, currying the roan. Was it a shot? A horse? Mine came down on me in a ford at the end of a very stupid afternoon, and there were 4 hours before anyone came, and by then it had set as it meant to go on. The hand was the same day differently. He watched the brush go round. It does not improve. Surgeons have had 3 separate attempts at telling me it might, and I have stopped paying them to. Does it pain you? In the cold. Always in the cold. Then I shall stop putting you at the end of the table by the window, said Tabitha, and you may be as annoyed about that as you like. He laughed, and she smiled, and then she went back to the roan and the guard came up again the way it always did. A shutter dropped very politely across a lit window. He had said a thing in a carriage in November. He was learning, slowly and expensively, that a sentence like that is not withdrawn by good behaviour in April. Mr. Dowsett came on the first Monday in May. He was a small, dry, courteous man in a bottle-green coat, and he laid out his papers on the estate room table like a man dealing patience. £6,300, Your Grace. Bills accepted by Lord Piers Fernacre over 4 years at Newmarket, at Boulogne and in Jermyn Street. They fall due at midsummer. They are my brother's bills, not mine. They are your brother's bills, and I have never pretended otherwise. Dowsett turned one round, but his lordship, when he could not pay, gave me security. He assigned me his expected interest in the Wen land, 311 acres and the mill, which came to the marriage settlement drawn for his lordship in October, and which passed, upon the alteration of the licence, to your Grace instead. Then your security is worth nothing. So my clerk said. Dowsett smiled without any pleasure at all. So my clerk said, Your Grace, until the 11th of April, when I was waited upon by a lady of this county, who put a different construction on the case, and by his lordship, who has come home. The citation was served on the 2nd of June, by a clerk of the consistory court, on a Tuesday morning in the yard with Sturrock standing there holding a bucket. Corwin read it 3 times. A cause of nullity of marriage, promoted by Lord Piers Fernacre against Corwin, Duke of Fernacre, and Tabitha, called Duchess of Fernacre. That the license of the Bishop's Court, dated the 29th of October, was issued for the marriage of Tabitha Wen, spinster with Piers Fernacre, and with no other person. That the alteration made at the altar step by the officiating curate was made without authority, upon a document already issued. That there being no valid license and no banns called for the parties actually married, the ceremony was a nullity and the said marriage void from the beginning. To be heard before the Chancellor of the Diocese at Norwich on the 29th day of September. Void from the beginning, Tabitha said. She had come up behind him, she read it over his arm, and her face did not change at all, which he had learned to fear more than tears. It will not stand, Corwin said. The register was signed. The vows were spoken. It is a technical. It will be heard on the 29th of September, and until it is heard, every person between here and Ipswich will say the word void at their dinner. She took the paper from him and folded it. Your Grace understands what it says about me. It says nothing about you. It says that I have lived 11 months in this house as your wife and may be found never to have been your wife at all. Her voice was very level. For you it is a legal inconvenience and a paragraph in the county paper. You will still be the Duke of Fernacre on the 30th of September. For me there is no version of the 30th of September in which I am anything a woman may go on being. My mother loses 200 a year and the cottage the same hour, and I shall have no name to take her to. The rooks went up off the elms. Sturrock tactfully took his bucket somewhere else. Piers wants the Wen land, said Corwin. Dowsett holds his paper, and he has promised what he cannot deliver, and the only road to delivering it runs through unmarrying you. Yes, he will not get. Your Grace, said Tabitha, has said that about your brother before. She walked back to the house, and he stood in the yard with the sun coming out and the citation gone out of his hands, and counted, without meaning to, the days to the 29th of September. There were 119. There is no music, Tabitha said. There is no music, Corwin agreed, and no company, and no supper, and the floor wants sweeping. I am aware the invitation is a poor one. It was the second week of July, and the long gallery at Fernacre had been shut for 9 years, and he had had the covers taken off that afternoon without telling anybody why. Your Grace does not dance. Your Grace does not dance, he said, and has not since Spain, and will make an exhibition of himself in about 90 seconds, and would like to do it in an empty room in front of exactly one person, if she will allow it. She put out her hand. He was slow, and the leg would not turn, and twice they simply stood still while he found the beat again out of a memory of a regimental band. At the end of the gallery, by the shuttered window, they had stopped moving some time before either noticed, and her hand was still in his damaged one, which she held as though there were nothing whatever remarkable about it. Tabitha, in the carriage, in November, I said a thing to you. I remember what your Grace said in November. I was wrong, said Corwin. I have been 11 months in a house with the best person in it, and have spent 9 of them congratulating myself on my honesty. I should like to begin again from the vestry door, if there is any way at all to be let. She looked up at him. There was one candle at the far end of 40 feet of floor. Ask me on the 30th of September, she said, when I am still your wife, or when I am not, and either way when nobody can say you did it because a court was coming. That is a yes. It is not a no, said Tabitha, and your Grace has never in his life been given so much. He sold the Fernacre house in Bath in August and put 4,000 into Dowsett's hands against the bills, on the sole condition that Dowsett give up his assignment of the Wen land, which Dowsett, being a businessman and not a partisan, did within the week. Piers came home on the 19th of August. He was thinner and browner and just as handsome, and he walked into the estate room without knocking and put a packet on the table, 40 letters, tied with faded pink tape in a small round hand that Corwin had seen on 11 months of stable accounts. Before you have me put out, Piers said, read 3 of those, any 3. I'll be at the Vasses till Friday. They were not dated, they were not addressed. There was no name at the head of any of them and no name at the foot, and they had never been sent. The tape had worn a groove into the top sheet from years of being tied and untied. You crossed the room to me when there was no one else in England who would have done it, and I do not think you have ever known what it was worth. I have carried that half-hour for 4 years now, the way other women carry a locket." Corwin read 11 of them standing up, and by the 8th his hands were not steady, and by the 11th he had built the whole thing in his head complete upon a foundation he had laid himself the previous November, the handsome one. Of the two, he sent for her that evening. Lady Honoria was in the drawing-room, and 2 of her people, and he did not send them away, which was the single decision he would come to regret above every other act of his life. "These are yours." Tabitha went white to the mouth. "Where did you get them?" "From my brother." "Who has had them, he says, some years." He put the packet down. "You need not answer. I am not going to make you answer in front of anybody. I shall not contest the suit at Norwich. My submission goes to the proctor tomorrow. The Wen land is clear of Dowsett and will be conveyed to you absolutely whatever the court finds, and your mother's annuity I shall charge upon myself personally, so that it stands if the marriage does not. You are giving me to him. I am taking myself out of the way," said Corwin. "There is a difference." "There is not," said Tabitha, "and if your grace will send these people out of the room, I will explain to you in 4 sentences exactly what those letters are, and you will never mention Norwich again." And the Duke of Fernacre, because Lady Honoria Vass was watching, and because a man who has just decided he is the lesser brother cannot bear to be pitied while he is being told so, and because he was at bottom a coward in precisely one respect and had never troubled to find out which, said, "There is nothing to explain. You may say it in front of the room or not at all." It was the sentence she had answered in a carriage in November. He heard it leave him and knew it and could not call it back. Tabitha stood quite still for the space of 3 breaths. "No, your grace," she said. She picked up the packet off the table and put it inside her shawl and made Lady Honoria a curtsy of impeccable civility and went out. He did not go up. He told himself he would go up in an hour, and then that he would speak to her at breakfast, and he sat in the estate room until 2 in the morning composing sentences that all began with the word if. At 4:30 she rose and dressed, and left a note for Sturrock about the roans off 4, and another for the housekeeper about the linen, and walked down to the Ipswich road in the dark to meet the mail with 1 box and her mother's veil in it. She left nothing for the Duke of Fernacre at all. She had 139 shillings, 41 days, and a suit of nullity in which she was named as a party in her own right, and she meant to stand up in Norwich and answer it herself. She would not take it, your grace. She counted it and gave it back and asked me how the roans off 4 was doing. Sturrock stood in the estate room in the first week of September with his hat in both hands and £40 in a bag on the table. "Where is she lodged?" "Over a saddler's in St. Benedict's, Norwich. 1 room and the use of the kitchen fire." Sturrock's jaw worked. "She's at a livery yard 6 days a week, sir. Schooling, 12 shillings and her dinner. The man who keeps it told me he'd have taken her at 20 if she'd let him know who she was. And she wouldn't, so she gets 12 like the rest. She'll ask after the horses and she'll not ask after your grace, and I'd sooner be kicked than carry it, if you want the truth of it." Corwin went to Norwich himself twice. The first time he got as far as the archway of the livery yard and saw her across it in a stable apron, walking a young grey on a long rein with 3 men watching her do it. And he understood that if he crossed that yard every one of those men would know inside a minute exactly who she was and what he had done, and that she had chosen 12 shillings precisely so that nobody would. He turned round. The second time he stood in the street and read over his own submission, the paper his proctor had entered in August, declining to defend the suit, and found there was no way on earth to unsay it that did not require her to be spoken for again by a man who had already proved what his speaking was worth. So he did the only thing left. On the 29th of September he came into the Chancellor's Court at Norwich at 10 in the morning and sat at the back, on the last bench by the door, and did not send in his name. The court was a low-panelled room with a coal fire that smoked, and there were perhaps 60 people in it, half of them the county coming from 12 miles round to see it. Lady Honoria Vass had a chair carried in. Piers sat with his proctor in a new blue coat and did not once look behind him. Tabitha came in alone at 3 minutes to 10 in the grey gown she had been married in, with her hair plain and her hands bare, and when the clerk asked whether she was represented, she said clearly, "No, sir, I appear for myself." The proctor for Lord Piers was thorough and unhurried and not unkind, and his case was very simple and very nearly unanswerable. The licence named one man, another was married, the alteration was made by a curate on a chancel step with no authority whatsoever, and therefore no marriage had ever taken place. But the whole of it, he said at last, comes at the end to one question, which this court has asked in cases like it for 300 years, not what the papers said, what the party intended. Madam, on the 29th of October last year, when you walked up that aisle, who did you go to that chapel to marry? Lord Piers Fernacre, said Tabitha. I had accepted him in July, and I went there to keep my word. A stir went round the room like wind in a barley field. And when you found he had gone, I married his brother, for the settlement. There was a settlement, and it kept my mother in her house, and I read every line of it in the vestry before I signed. I will not pretend I did not. She had her hands folded in front of her. But you have asked me what I intended, sir, and I have been 41 days in a room over a saddler's shop deciding whether I would answer it honestly, and I find that I will, and that it will cost me a good deal more than it costs anybody else in this room. Madam, the court requires my consent, said Tabitha, and my consent has a date on it, and the date is not the 29th of October. The Chancellor put down his pen. On the 3rd of September, 1804, there was a subscription assembly at Coatesbury. I was 17. My father had been sold up 11 days before, and everybody in that room knew it, and I stood against the wall from 8 o'clock until 9:30, and not one man in that county crossed the floor to me. Because a girl whose father has been sold up is a draught they would all rather not sit in. Her voice did not rise. At 9:30, a captain of dragoons home on leave, who had been in the room 10 minutes and knew nothing about any of it, walked the whole length of the floor in front of 200 people and asked me to stand up with him, and then took me into supper and talked to me for half an hour about horses, so that I should not have to talk about my father. He never learned my name. He went back to Spain in the November and came home 9 years later on a stick, and he had no more notion who I was than the fire irons. She turned her head once and looked straight at the last bench by the door. That was the Duke of Fernacre. He was not a duke then, and I did not know he ever would be. I accepted his brother because his brother asked me and he never would, and because I was 30 and my mother was lame, and one cannot live on a half hour at an assembly for 13 years, though I can tell this court that I very nearly did. She untied the pink tape and laid the packet on the table in front of the Chancellor. Those are 41 letters in my hand, written between 1805 and last March. Not one is addressed and not one was sent, and my Lord Piers took them out of my writing desk when 4 years ago, and has been good enough to believe ever since that they were meant for him. The court will observe that the earliest of them describes the assembly at Coatesbury. His lordship was not in England in the September of 4. He was at Lisbon with his regiment, and there are 11 people in this room who can say so. The smoke from the coal fire hung along the panelling, and nobody in that court made a sound at all. I have loved the Duke of Fernacre since I was 17 years old, said Tabitha. When? That is what I intended on the 29th of October. The court may make of it whatever the law obliges. My Lord Chancellor, I ask leave to withdraw my submission and be heard. The Duke of Fernacre had got to his feet at the back of the court, and every head in the room came round, and he came up the aisle between the benches on his stick, slowly, in front of the whole of Norfolk, because there was no faster way, and he had stopped caring who watched him do it. Your Grace entered a submission declining to defend. I did, on the 20th of August. I asked the court to note the date and the reason, and I would rather give the reason myself than have it guessed at over dinner for the next 20 years. He set his hand on the rail. On the 19th of August my brother put a packet of letters in my hand and told me they had been written to him. I read 11 of them, and I believed him, because it suited a low opinion I have had of myself since I came home from Spain, and because it is easier to be nobly disappointed than to ask a plain question and hear an answer you have not earned. My wife asked me to send 3 people out of the room and let her explain in 4 sentences. I refused her. I refused her in exactly the words I had used to her in a carriage on our wedding day, when I told her she must not hope for anything from me, and I did it because Lady Honoria Vass was sitting by the fire and I could not bear to be seen to be told. That is the whole of it. There is no better version. A woman schooled horses for 12 shillings a week in St. Benedict's for 6 weeks because I would not clear a drawing room. Your Grace's contrition is noted, said the Chancellor, and is not evidence. No, my lord. But it is a fact, and this county has come 12 miles for facts today, and they may as well have the one that matters. Judgment was given at 4 o'clock. The license had been irregularly altered, and the curate would answer to his bishop for it. But the statute struck at parties who knowingly and wilfully married in undue form, and neither of these had done anything of the kind. The one had been jilted at the door of the church, and the other handed a letter at the chancel step. And both had spoken the words and signed the register in their own true names before 140 witnesses. The marriage was pronounced good and valid from the beginning. The letters were ordered restored to the Duchess of Fernacre, and the manner of their taking referred to the county attorney, and Lord Piers Fernacre left the court by a side door and left England 11 days later for a cousin's estate in the Canadas, his passage and his paper paid in full by his brother, on the single written condition that he never again enter the county of Norfolk. Corwin found her in the passage outside. Tabitha, not today, she said. Please, not in a corridor with 60 people coming out of a door. Then when? Michaelmas quarter day. I have given the livery yard my month, and I do not leave a place without finishing what I said I would do. She was pale and her eyes were bright, and she was, unmistakably, herself, and your Grace has not asked me anything yet. He has only stood up in a court and said he was wrong, which is a great deal, and is not the same thing. The Coatesbury Subscription Assembly was held on the 11th of October, as it had been every autumn for 40 years. 200 people. The same long room, the same 3 fiddles, the same painted pillars. She came in at 8 with her mother on her arm and stood against the wall on the left-hand side, which was where she had stood in 1804, and did it deliberately, and did not look about her. At 9:30 the Duke of Fernacre came in at the far end of the room, alone, and stopped, and looked down the whole length of it. Then he walked the floor. It took him a long time. The stick sounded on the boards and the fiddles kept going and the room went quiet in patches as it understood what it was watching, and by the time he was 2/3 of the way across, nobody in the Cottesbury Assembly rooms was pretending to do anything else, Lady Honoria Vass least of all. He stopped in front of her and bowed. Madam, I do not know your name and I have no right to it. Will you stand up with me? Your Grace does not dance, said Tabitha, and her voice cracked on the second word. Your Grace dances extremely badly in an empty gallery with 1 candle in front of exactly 1 person. He held out his damaged hand, palm up, in front of 200 of them. I am told the trick is to do it where they can all see and go slowly and not care. It took me 13 years and a court of law to be taught it, and I was taught it by you. She put her hand in his. They were married again on a bright, still morning in November, in the chapel at Fernacre, with banns properly called on 3 Sundays and no license and no letter and nobody's name written over anybody else's. He walked up the aisle himself and stood there half an hour early, because he could not be persuaded to sit down. Sturrock gave her away and wept without apology through the whole of it. Mrs. Wen had the Wen land settled upon her for life, and lived at Fernacre in the south rooms, because her daughter would not hear of anything else. The letters were untied one at a time that winter by the fire in the long gallery, and read aloud by him badly, and with a great many interruptions, because he said a man should have to hear every word of what he had been too stupid to be told. 13 years, he said once, at the bottom of one of them. You might have written the direction on a single one of these. And had it laughed at in a regimental mess in Spain, said Tabitha, from the other end of the sofa, with her feet under a rug and the Bay Filly's stud book open on her knees. No. You crossed the room to me once when there was nothing in it for you, and I lived on that for 13 years, and I would have gone on living on it. That is not a complaint, Corwin. It is only the truth, and you may have it now, since you have gone to such trouble for it." He looked at her a long moment in the firelight. "Then I shall cross it again in the morning," said the Duke of Fernacre, "and every morning after, so that there is no possible doubt." And he did, for 31 years, in a house with every door hung the wrong way round, and a strap on the near rein, and 11 yearlings in the top yard every spring.